This is a video interview of Holocaust survivor Alex Kuhn. The interview is taken at the Holocaust Memorial Center, founded by the Sharit HaPleta organization in West Bloomfield, Michigan, on June 11, 1986. The interviewer is Esther Wine. Can you please state for us your name, where you were born, and where you were living at the time?
My name is Alex Kuhn. I was born in Hungary, in the town of Kisvárda, which is in the northeast section of Hungary.
Can you describe your life before the war?
In the 1930s, the life of the Jews were already affected by anti-Jewish laws and the laws that they had enacted. My father was employed in an industry which was government-controlled. The distillery was leased by a man who was also Jewish. He lost his lease, and consequently my father found himself out of a job. This was in 1937.
How old were you in 1937?
I was 8 years old.
And how old a man was your father?
Well, in 1937 he was 45. After that, my father moved from one job to another since as the leases expired on these refineries, on these distilleries, they wouldn't renew them. They wouldn't renew it to Jews anymore. And as their employment expired, they wouldn't renew their contracts. So consequently, between 1938 and 1944, we moved no less than 6 times.
How large a family were you from?
When the war started, there were 7 of us living. I had 3 brothers and 3 sisters.
And where were you amongst
I was in the
7?
I was in the middle. I had 3 younger than I and 3 older. I had 2 younger sisters and a younger brother, and 2 older brothers and 1 older sister.
So the family with 7 children had to move many times because
right. In 1940, I had 1 additional baby brother who lived only 6 months. He developed a staph infection, and for lack of good medical care, he didn't survive.
Can you tell us what the city was like that you were living in? How large a city was it?
Where I was born, this was a community of approximately 30,000 people. There were about 10,000 Jews in town. Was a medium-sized Jewish community, a very tight-knit Jewish community.
How many synagogues? And
probably no less than a dozen synagogues. Several Hebrew schools of various shades, from ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic to the very modern contemporary.
And what would you say your family observed?
My parents were Orthodox, but modern Orthodox, even then.
Modern Orthodox.
Although my grandfather had a full-length beard, he was very strict. Incidentally, I lived with him for 2 years in the 1930s when my parents had to move again, and there were no educational facilities, Jewish school in town where they moved to. My younger sister and I were left with my grandparents for 2 years. to go to school.
So what was the city that you were living in last as a family?
The city that we were deported from was Zalaegerszeg, which is in the southwestern corner of Hungary, near the Yugoslav-Austrian border.
And this was a small city? What would you
small
say the
town,
population?
approximately 1,000 people, and about 25 Jewish families in town.
Can you describe for us what a Friday night was like in your home?
Friday night and Shabbat, of course, was the highlight of the week. My father worked from early morning till late in the evening, and sometimes he kept a cot in his office at the distillery, and he stayed there during the night because they were on a 24-hour schedule. And of course, Friday night, regardless how meager circumstances were, it was always the Shabbat meal with the home-baked challah and the chicken soup and the best of everything that the circumstances would allow. There were times when we lived in a community that didn't have a synagogue. So it was customary in our house that Saturday morning my father would read the weekly portion. My father would read the weekly portion to us from the Chumash. So we shouldn't miss out on that experience. Mm-hmm. And this went on for years when we did not have a synagogue close by that we could walk to, that we could attend regularly. Saturday night, when Shabbat would be over, my father was an amateur violinist. He played the violin, and he played like a gypsy. He played from without knowing a note. He couldn't read a note of music, but he played all the Jewish tunes and all the Hungarian tunes, all the operatic tunes. And there was a very memorable experience for me that I recall vividly to this day, and I tell my children about it.
What about your religious education? You went to a regular school?
I attended a public school in the morning and a Hebrew school in the afternoon. Was a difficult schedule because when I first started going to school, as I mentioned, I lived with my grandfather, and I ate at different relatives every day of the week, and sometimes even my meals during the day would be taken at different relatives' houses. So I would have to walk to a relative's house, have breakfast, and walk to school. Then I would be in school till 12 or 1 o'clock, and then in the afternoon over to Hebrew school, and then at night again to somebody else's house to have supper.
That was a difficult
it went on for 2 years, and it's something that my mother regretted later on as things deteriorated. She always regretted that we spent those 2 years away from my parents. But at that time, of course, Jewish education being of paramount importance, they felt that that was the right thing to do.
What was your family's political affiliations or ideas? Were they involved in any organizations?
Not that I can recall. My father was not active politically. although I remember very well his leanings were liberal, left of center. In today's comparison. But he was not a member of any organized political party.
Did you encounter any anti-Semitism before the war?
My first experience with anti-Semitism was in grade school, in first grade. Having lived with my grandfather, as I mentioned, I was brought up stricter than I would have been at home with my parents. Consequently, I had a payas. And that's something that in 1937 or 1938 gave my schoolmates and boys on the street an excuse to take advantage of it and pull it and beat me up. That was my first experience with anti-Semitism. I was 7 or 8 years old.
Was it a part of your life?
It was a daily reminder. Also, the fact that I went to a public school in the morning, that created a problem. The fact that I wore a hat to school in the morning, and that in itself was unusual because most of the boys, certainly the non-Jewish boys, did not wear a hat to school. If you wore a hat, that meant that you were religious, or that you did not walk around without a hat.
And so you felt as if you were outsiders.
Yes.
To the community.
Yes.
Can you describe for us how your experiences with the war began? Where were you when the war began?
For me, the war began in 1939 when my father and my oldest brother were first drafted into the army, and subsequently they were both transferred to a labor unit when Jewish boys and men were no longer fit to serve in the Hungarian army. They still had the uniform, but they were transferred into labor brigades. These brigades were attached to the army units, and they did all the heavy work, the construction work at the railroad lines and highway construction and so on for the army.
I think we didn't mention before that although you were one of 7 children, you come from a large extended family.
Yes, my mother's family was a large family. She had 14 sisters and brothers.
How many of those survived the Holocaust?
2 survived. 2 sisters survived.
And your father's family?
My father's family was smaller. My father had 3 sisters, and 1 survived the Holocaust. 1 aunt who we were fortunate to be able to visit her after the war on her 92nd birthday. She passed away shortly after that.
Of your immediate family of 7 children, how many survived?
My oldest brother and I, 2 of us survived. He survived in Siberia. He was shipped out to Russia with his labor unit in 1942. And shortly after that, he disappeared. We last heard of him in October of 1942, and after that, there was no correspondence at all. We did not know whether he was alive or not till after the war was over.
This was the same brother who was drafted with your father into
in
the
1939, right.
So he survived.
He survived in Russia, yes.
You were saying that your first remembrance was when your father and your brother were drafted.
Yes. My father was released shortly after that. He was in only 6 months. I say only 6 months. You can, I don't know if you can appreciate the emotional state of my mother, who was left home with 6 children and no husband and no provider. These were times that were already difficult. As I mentioned before, my father moved from one job to another, and we didn't have what to fall back on. So when he was gone, there was no...
And how old were the children?
Well, in 1939, my youngest brother was 4 years old. And my oldest brother, who was already in the labor unit, he was 20.
And how did your family respond?
We rallied around my mother, of course, and we tried to be of some help. My older brother, who was 15 years old at the time, got a part-time job after school, and he helped out. And
were there
those were
other members of the extended family who were
in the immediate area? No. At this time already, when we already lived near the Austrian border, most of our relatives were either back in Budapest, which was about 200 miles away, or in the city in Kisvárda where I was born. So we didn't have relatives nearby, and that made it even more difficult.
There were no options.
There were no options. At this time we lived on a farm, and there was no Jewish community around us. We were isolated. And a year later, again, the lease expired on this refinery, and we moved again. This was in 1941. And the winter of 1941-42 was a very difficult one. My father did not have a job.
Your father was back from the labor camp?
My father was back from the labor camp. He was not able to find work in his profession or in any other field. He was out of work for almost a year. Finally, he got a part-time job, I remember, in a town about 10 miles away, and was winter, and he didn't want to spend the money on a train ticket. He walked home, and I remember him coming home with a loaf of bread under his arm. So we had something to eat. We lived in a cold flat. There was no heat in the flat. It was a very difficult year.
Were there initial changes in your daily routine? Were you still going to school, and
yes,
you were still living in your home? And
we were still living at home at this time, and we attended school on a regular basis, yes. The following year, in 1942, we moved again. My father got a job in this town where later we were deported from, in Zololev. And that was in a tile and brick plant where they made roofing tiles and construction brick. We moved there, sometime during the summer of 1942. Shortly after that, my second brother was drafted into the labor brigade, and he disappeared. We heard from him for about 6 months, and he was part of a unit that was based in Koseg, which had a very bad reputation of being one of the worst labor camps or labor brigades in Hungary. Very few boys survived this particular camp. After 6 months, we didn't see him, and he disappeared.
When were you deported?
We were deported in early May 1944.
Up until that time, you were living in your home in
March,
Zalalova.
Yes, until March 1944. The Germans occupied Hungary in March of 44, and shortly after that, events began to move very fast.
But up until that time, there were still meager food available. And
yes, and we lived at home with some semblance of normalcy, although I remember waiting for mail every day, trying to, hoping to hear from my brothers. By then, 2 of them were missing.
And did you have knowledge of what was going on in politics and in the other countries? And
not really. Somewhere along the way, Jews were forbidden to own radios. If you owned a radio, you had to turn it in. If you subscribed to a newspaper or periodicals, they were canceled. So we were pretty much isolated from any outside information.
How much did your family know of what was going on?
There were constant rumors. People that were being deported, their relatives spoke to other people, and there were constant rumors.
Did they believe the rumors?
No, no. That was one of the great tragedies, that nobody wanted to believe what was happening. And since it was happening so gradually, and many of the rumors I know were started by the Hungarian and the German Nazis.
Rumors such as?
Rumors such as resettlement program, that people that are being moved from their hometowns, they are being resettled in the eastern regions.
Even as late as 44, you thought there was resettlement.
On the way to Auschwitz, we thought there was a resettlement program. At one point, my brother and I talked about sneaking across the Yugoslav border because we were so close to the Yugoslav border.
Was that an option?
That was an option. Many people did.
And did they survive?
Their chances of survival was probably better than ending up in Auschwitz. My mother vetoed that. She was against it. She said, wherever we're going together. Of course, nobody knew, and she had no idea that we would end up in Auschwitz. Because the euphemism that was used was that we're being resettled.
So those options were essentially closed to you?
Yes, yes.
There was no, you were not sent to a ghetto?
Yes, we were. We were sent to a ghetto shortly after the Germans occupied Hungary, which was the middle of March 19th, 1944. Within 2 weeks, we were in a ghetto. First, we all were required to put on the yellow star, the Star of David.
You left your home.
We left our home, and we were taken to the nearest city, which was the county seat, where the county ghetto was established and all the surrounding communities were assembled in this particular town. There we were placed in a section of the city that was walled off, closed off from the rest of the town. And I believe, if I remember correctly, we were in 2 rooms.
You were about 12 years old at this time?
Yes, 13 years old.
And you have a recollection of it?
Yes.
2 small rooms?
2 small rooms. But that wouldn't have been a great problem. Of course, as it turned out, we didn't stay there that long. We were there approximately 3 weeks or maybe 4. At the end of that period, we were taken out of these buildings and placed in an open pit, which was a open pit mine, clay quarry, where they dug for clay for industrial purposes. Many of the Jewish communities found themselves in that situation. The reason for that being is that they were easy to supervise. The Hungarian Nazis and the German SS had an easier time guarding an area that was in a ravine or in a mine pit like this was.
So it was an open
It was an open area.
How many people would you say were?
I'm guessing, but there must have been 4,000 or 5,000 people there. We spent 7 days there. It never stopped raining for 7 days.
Where were they sleeping and eating?
In the open. We were sleeping in the open. There were no sanitary facilities. The head of the household, in this case my father, was taken into an area there, a building, where he was questioned as to any valuables or any money that we were hiding on our person or anywhere else. And the SS or their Hungarian cohorts were not beyond beating up people to get a confession out of them if they had actually hidden anything.
Did your father have anything?
We didn't have anything, any of any value hidden. We did leave a few items that were of sentimental value with neighbors right before we left. Those things were gone.
Were your neighbors of any help to you?
Not really. I think most of the non-Jews, most of the Gentiles were afraid to help. I think, in all fairness, they were just as shocked as what was happening as we were. There were people who were trying to be helpful. I remember people, as we were being loaded on the train to leave for the ghetto, people were lining the streets and crying. These were our neighbors, Gentile neighbors. And there were many who applauded and hoping to gain something from it. End up with an apartment or a house or valuables or furniture. When we left home, we only took with us what we could carry. So everything was left in the house.
You were saying that you were in this open quarry type of mine for
Yes.
7 days.
We spent 7 days there. At the end of the 7 days, we were taken to a railroad station, and we were loaded into freight cars, cattle or freight cars. anywhere from 75 to 100 people to a freight car. And
did you still think it was going to be resettlement?
yes, yes, that's what the guards were telling everybody. Of course, they used that to have people be more cooperative, probably. People pacify people, so they shouldn't put up a fight or take any drastic action.
Do you recall the cattle car experience?
Yes, the ride was to Auschwitz was 3 days, and the only food we had was, again, what we carried with us, what we had brought from the ghetto, which wasn't very much. We were told at every railroad station where the train stopped that we would get food and water at the next railroad station, which of course never happened. There wasn't enough room to stretch out or even to sit down in some cases. Many people were standing in the railroad car. Again, there were no sanitation facilities, and we were not permitted to leave the freight cars even when we came to a railroad station where the train stopped. At the end of 3 days when we arrived in Auschwitz, of course, none of us knew what Auschwitz represented. We had no idea what it was.
You had heard of Auschwitz?
No.
You hadn't heard of it?
And this was already May 1944. We tried to get some idea where we were going. We tried to read the name of the town where we stopped at a railroad station to get some idea where we were going. When we arrived in Auschwitz, it was a total shock. People were unloaded from the freight cars, lined up, women and children on one side in one row, and men on the other side. And I don't remember if my mother told me to go with my father, but I don't think she did. I just ran toward my father instinctively.
Was there, two of your brothers had already gone
Two of my older brothers.
So you were the only son?
Right, and I had a younger brother who went with my mother.
The 6-month-old?
No, in 1944 he was 9 years old. He was born in 1935.
This wasn't the infant?
No, the infant died in 1940.
Before
things really went bad. My two younger sisters, my older sister, and my younger brother went with my mother. There too, the women were separated. Those that were able to work were sent to a labor camp or to a labor unit in Auschwitz. And I went with my father and went through the reception area. They shaved our heads, all the hair off the body, and took our clothes, gave us a towel and a bar of soap, and asked us to walk into a large room. This was the same room that was either a gas chamber or a shower area. If you were lucky, you walked out on the other side. There were two large doors. We walked in on one end of the room and walked out on the other end. In my case, I was fortunate. My father and I walked out on the other end of the room.
You were actually quite young to be selected for labor camp.
I was 14 years old.
Were you large in size?
No, I wasn't. I was quite small for my age. But the Germans were running short of workers, and they suffered tremendous losses on the Russian front, and they weren't too particular as to who was going to do their work for them.
And the same is true of your father. He was over 40.
My father at this point was 52.
And what happened with your mother and your sisters?
That was the last time I saw them, and that was the last time I heard from them. There were times where there were messages sent back and forth between the different sections of the camp, between the women's camps and the men's area, where people would say, well, I saw such and such person, and then this information would be handed down from one person to the next. So for a while, I heard that my older sister was there in Auschwitz in a labor unit, but lost track of her. If she actually did survive or did leave Auschwitz, I don't know.
And then what happened with you and your father?
My father and I ended up in the same area in Auschwitz, an area called Birkenau, which was an area that housed gypsies and Jews. Half the camp was gypsies, and half of it were Jewish prisoners. At one point, all the barracks, the houses, the buildings we were in were locked for 24 hours. We couldn't leave the building. And the next day, when doors were finally opened, there were no gypsies in sight. We were told that they were gassed and they went to their death. They were
as late as 44.
As late as 44. This was already June or maybe July 1944.
What kind of work were you doing?
In Birkenau, we didn't do any work. The worst part of Birkenau was you didn't know when your number would come up, because every day there was a selection process. People that were strong enough to work, they were selected and sent off to a labor camp. People that weren't strong enough, they did not leave there. They didn't survive. Just to give you an idea, today it's almost humorous. When we first arrived in Auschwitz, they didn't have utensils. They didn't have plates or pots and pans. The utensils that we carried with us into Auschwitz were used to feed the people. And if they found a large pot that was big enough for 20 people, they would put in 20 ladles of soup, and they counted off 20 people, and you were on your own. If you were big and strong, you got your ladle of soup out of that pot of 420. If you weren't, you didn't get anything.
And how was your physical health at the time?
My physical health held up relatively well. Fortunately, after 4 months, my father was being selected for a transport to leave Auschwitz.
You were in Birkenau for 4 months?
Yes. And of course, at that point, I didn't know where he was going, but I felt wherever he was going, I was going with him. And I ran after him, and I became part of the transport that was leaving for a labor camp, which turned out to be Mauthausen. Mauthausen is in Austria near the German border. Again, they loaded us into freight cars, and after a 2-day journey, we arrived in Mauthausen. At that point, I think all of us who got out of Auschwitz at that point felt that our chances of survival improved. Not that Mauthausen was an easy place to be. It was a rock quarry or a stone quarry. We were digging tunnels into the mountainside. The Germans were planning to move their munitions plants into these tunnels. Fortunately, the war ended before they had a chance to do that. But that's what these tunnels were being dug for. They would blast large blocks of rocks out of the mountainside, and we would carry it up to the ground level. Again, this was an open pit mine. We would carry it up on our shoulders, up 173 steps.
You were carrying rocks?
Yes, large blocks of rocks.
And your father was doing this
yes.
too?
These blocks were dropped off at a roadside away from the mine, and there were other prisoners there who would be hammering away at these and breaking them up into smaller pieces for the roadbed, covering the roadbed. Of course, the German SS and the camp guards who were there would push you along, shove you along, either with a rifle butt or with the rubber hose to make sure that you moved fast enough to their liking. In this particular camp in Mauthausen, we were intermingled with German political prisoners and criminals. And the people who were put in charge were generally the worst criminals that the camp guards could find. After a while, you would find a way to rate these people. On your striped uniform, you had a number, a prison number, and before the prison number was a triangle indicating either your nationality. In this case, we had a yellow triangle for Jewish, and the political prisoners would have a red triangle, and the criminals would have a black triangle. So when you see somebody with a black triangle, you knew to stay away from them if you had a chance, if you had a choice.
The red were
political. These were, of course, socialists and communists. And anybody that disagreed with the system, they were imprisoned.
So you had contact with other prisoners who were not Jewish prisoners?
Yes, yes. There were many political prisoners in Mauthausen, both German and from the occupied countries, especially from Czechoslovakia and also from Poland.
What were the living conditions, the food? And
when we first arrived in Mauthausen, there were the housing was in converted army barracks. Just one large room. There were no beds. At night, we were bedded down on the floor, with or without a blanket, whatever the case happened to be. Packed in like sardines because of the overcrowded conditions. The food was the usual ration. In the morning, you would have a slice of bread and coffee. At noon, a ladle of soup, such as it was, and at night, again, a slice of bread, usually with either with a cup of soup or with a slice of margarine or a little cube of margarine. I think that's where I got to dislike margarine.
So you had very meager food. You had
very meager food. There, of course, one of the most difficult things was to, especially in retrospect, to have to see your parents suffer and go without. My father was a heavy smoker. He would trade away a slice of bread for a cigarette if he could get a cigarette from somebody. And I was the one that watched out for him. I was the one that made sure that he didn't trade away his bread for a cigarette. And as funny as it seems, I had the feeling that when we were finally separated in November 1944, that I feared for his health and for his well-being, because I knew that he had given up and he wasn't taking care of himself.
Before you were separated, up till November, how long were you and your father both in Mauthausen?
We got there in September, and we were there till November.
So it was a few months. And
about 3 months.
How was his health holding up?
He was losing a lot of weight, I remember, and his health was deteriorating. In November, we were moved to Vienna with a transport.
Do you remember any form of resistance at Mauthausen?
Within the camp? No. No. There were escapes or attempted escapes. How many made it successfully, I don't know. But I remember the sirens going off in the middle of the night and being lined up for a head count. And sometimes they would find the escapee, sometimes they wouldn't. If they didn't find them, it was worse on the prisoners who were in camp, because they would take it out on those who were left.
In general, can you describe the treatment by the guards, the punishments?
Over and above the heavy workload and the lack of food, the physical punishment was consisted of the water hoses that were used, the rubber hoses for beating.
Was it indiscriminate?
Indiscriminate for no particular reason. Maybe you didn't move as fast as the camp guard wanted you to move. The fact that you were already falling over the man in front of you because he couldn't move any faster than you were, because his strength wasn't any better. That didn't bother him. He wanted you to step over him if he fell. The workload was heavy enough, and the lack of food was enough to contribute to the general rundown condition.
Was there illness in the camp?
At that point, not unusually so yet. That came later on, during the winter.
You mentioned the psychological state of your father. Can you expand on that?
Well, I remember him being very quiet. He of course was totally helpless, and I'm sure it was more difficult for him to see me under those circumstances, those conditions, than it was for me.
How about your psychological state at the time?
You live one day at a time.
Was that your philosophy?
Yes, and I think generally the people who made it through, that was what you had to do. You survived one day at a time. Early in camp, we would save part of our evening ration of bread for the next morning. Then when we found that somebody who was a little more desperate or more hungry than you were would sneak your bread away during the night, and he would eat it to survive. So then you learn to eat your bread ration at night, not to worry about the next morning. So.
But not everyone had that same psychological set of one day at a time.
No, I think a lot of people couldn't cope with it, and I remember seeing people grab the high voltage fence and commit suicide. Not everybody.
Was that an unusual thing?
Not really. Not so much in Mauthausen, but in Auschwitz there was a daily happening, where it was very difficult to see where there would be any improvement in the conditions.
So it certainly wasn't the majority of people who had the day at a time philosophy.
I'm sure not. As young as I was very, very determined to make it out of there one way or another, and be able to tell about it.
That's what I was really trying to bring out. Was that
to be able to tell about it? Yes, I'm sure.
You were very determined at the time.
The determination and the willpower had a lot to do with it, and I think.
Were you determined to survive, to help your father?
The will to survive. That too. While we were together till November of '44, yes, I looked out for my father. I would go over and talk to him, and tell him that I would tell him that it was important to eat whatever food there was available. That he shouldn't neglect himself. He shouldn't let his health run down any worse than it was. But today, I can appreciate more his totally hopeless mental and emotional situation.
Were there any religious activities going on at the time that you remember?
Yes, interestingly enough, the day we left Auschwitz, when we were moved from Auschwitz, was the second day of Rosh Hashanah, 1944. And when they ordered us to line up, we were in the middle of services. How they got a tallis or a prayer book into Auschwitz, I don't know. I could never figure it out. Although I heard from people who worked around the reception area that they were the ones who snuck these things into camp, because when you arrived, you were stripped completely, so you couldn't carry anything on you. But the people who worked around the reception area were also prisoners, Jews, would apparently sneak these things that people dropped off.
Confiscated them.
Yes, and they would take them into camp. There was a shofar. Rosh Hashanah, I heard the shofar blown in 1944, which was today. It seems impossible that people had, even at that point, had that kind of faith. That to
why do you feel that?
I was too young to appreciate what was really happening. Today, I can think back and ask how people could really believe at that point to assemble and hold services on Rosh Hashanah 1944.
Do you remember anything else about the service that was held there?
I only remember that we were interrupted and we were ordered to line up, and shortly after that we were counted off. I believe there were 200 who were counted off at that particular group, and we left Auschwitz. Was the second day of Rosh Hashanah.
Were there any other experiences that you remember of religious celebration at any other time or place?
Yom Kippur, the same year, of course. 10 days later, we were in Mauthausen already. And both my father and I fasted.
Mm.
And the evening meal was given out before sunset, so we didn't go for our evening meal, so consequently we didn't eat till the next day.
Didn't it strike you as peculiar to fast, or wasn't it something you thought of?
I guess your religious practices become so ingrained in you, so much a part of you, that you don't think about it. You don't think of eating on Yom Kippur.
So you just didn't think of it?
Didn't give it any particular thought.
Did your father continue his religious observations over the next several months?
Not really. There were no facilities. Nobody had any prayer books or anything. I have the feeling that he lost hope and faith at the same time, and I doubt very much that he believed in anything at that point.
You began to talk about your father's psychological state at about the time that you were separating from him.
We were moved from Mauthausen to Vienna. It was sometime in the beginning of November 1944. And there we were separated. He ended up in a parts plant in Mödling, which is a Vienna suburb. It was a airplane parts manufacturing plant. And I ended up in Schwechat, which is the site of the present-day Vienna airport. I worked on the assembly line, assembling the first jets that the Germans were about to put into full production, and they were hoping to use it against the Allied armies. Fortunately, they didn't work out. at this stage they were very much experimental, and many times we would see them take off and crash right near the factory. But somehow I had the feeling that at the time we were separated, that it didn't bid well for my father, because I was just concerned that he wasn't taking care of himself. He call it premonition, if you will. I had the feeling that he wasn't going to make it.
His health was failing?
His health was failing, and I think it was more his mental state and his emotional health than his physical.
You thought that he had given in?
That he had given up. The truck drivers that would deliver parts from the plant where he worked to the assembly plant where I worked would carry messages back and forth. And there were times when we would indirectly hear about each other. I knew that he was alive, that he was working. And
did you hear messages about what was happening in the world, you know, that
outside,
if the end was approaching?
No. Even though we were working under Austrian civilians at this particular factory, where the professionals, the mechanics and the engineers were all civilians who commuted to the factory from their homes daily, they were afraid to talk to us, even if they wanted to. Consequently, we didn't know. When we left Auschwitz in September, 30 days later, or maybe 6 weeks later, Auschwitz was liberated by the Russians. We didn't know what was happening. We didn't know what was going on.
So there were no rumors that the war was ending? You wanted to hang it?
Even in the summer of 1944, when the Normandy landing took place, we didn't know that there was a second front. We had no idea. At that time, we were still naive enough to think that Roosevelt was going to be our savior, and we were hoping that he would come to our rescue. Not only us, even the Nazis.
That was the belief?
That was the belief. That was the belief. And not only us, not only the Jews, but also the German propaganda was playing it up in the newspapers that Roosevelt is going to be your Messiah, is going to be your Of course, the Germans knew Roosevelt, and they knew that Roosevelt wasn't going to do anything. And that was one of the sad truths of that era, that the Germans knew who they were dealing with. Excuse me for digressing, but that gave Hitler encouragement. The fact that the Allies, especially the United States, did not make a strong enough stand against Hitler. When Elie Wiesel talks about this in his book, about the possibility of bombing the railroad lines to Auschwitz, which could have saved 1 million Hungarian Jews, even as late as the summer of 1944, Roosevelt refused to do it. Today we know that he was approached with this, and the means were there, because the bombing, the planes were there, the planes were flying, their accuracy was good enough, even though he claimed that there would be a chance of hitting inmates and killing innocent people. We know that wasn't a problem. But getting back to the situation in Vienna at the time, The plant I was working in was an assembly plant, an airplane assembly plant. My particular assignment, my job, along with one other boy my age, was to mount a steel plate on the nose section of the plane. We had to drill the holes in this steel plate and mount it on the nose section of the plane. The normal work schedule was a 12-hour day, which started at 6 o'clock in the morning, and as we got into the winter of 44, 45, in many cases we worked around the clock. You worked a 24-hour shift. Because as I read later, after the war, this was Hitler's last hope of using these jet planes against the Allied armies, because this was an unknown thing. Nobody else had it at that point.
But you weren't aware of that then?
I wasn't aware of it. I asked the civilian engineer that I was working under how this plane was going to fly, because there was no propeller on the plane. He wouldn't explain, of course, and I wouldn't have understood probably if he had explained it. The daily routine consisted of pretty much the same food ration that we had before, which deteriorated as we got into the winter of 44, 45. The bombing raids that came up the U.S. Air Force on a daily basis. We were taken to air raid shelters. And sometimes we would leave the factory 10 o'clock in the morning and not get back till 3 o'clock in the afternoon or after they all clear.
When was this? What month?
Oh, December, January.
So you knew that the Allies were close?
We knew that the Allies were close enough to be bombing there. The middle of February, they leveled the plant completely. We left the plant in the morning. They took us to the railroad, to the air raid shelters, and we came back in the afternoon, and there was no plant. The factory was leveled to the ground. And interestingly enough, the living quarters, which was directly adjacent to the factory, was intact. This was a very small camp. I think there was only 500 inmates in this camp. So the entire camp was built in a U shape. One wing of the U was the assembly plant. The shops were back here, and the other wing was the living quarters for the prisoners. And it says something for the accuracy of the U.S. bombing raids, that the living quarters was untouched.
So did you return to those quarters?
We returned to that, and of course we were elated that there wouldn't be any work to do. Would be free to rest up, just be in our living quarters. But we had no such luck, because they took us out to the airport, and we did the cleanup detail around the airport, bombed out buildings, and so on. This was February and March of 1945. And even at this point, we had no idea how close we were to the end of the war. On April 1st, 1945, the camp was being evacuated. We were marched back to the camp where my father was, where we were separated in Mödling, and I was hoping to find my father there, but I didn't. I was later told by two men who were with him that he was charged with sabotage and he was shot by the SS, by the Nazi guards.
Did you believe that?
I believe that for one reason, for the same reason that we talked about before, that he had given up so completely that he knew the consequences of what he did. Although you didn't have to be particularly destructive to be charged with sabotage. You could drill a piece of metal wrong, and you could be charged with something like that. I mean, they didn't have much of an excuse. They didn't need much of an excuse to take somebody out and shoot them. They weren't going to tell me about this till I don't know when, but we were marching back to Mauthausen, and about 4 or 5 days out of Vienna, my condition was getting very, very bad.
This was the death march?
This was the death march from Vienna to Mauthausen, 8 days.
8 days?
April 1st to April 8th. And I understand that the total number of men who started out from Vienna were around 3,000, and approximately 300 of us arrived in Mauthausen. And they weren't going to tell me what happened, these two men who were with my father. But when they saw that I may not make it, they decided to tell me about it, that I should know.
They felt that would encourage you?
I don't know whether they thought that they would encourage me, although they were practically dragging me along at this point. My feet were swollen beyond recognition. My shoes were gone. They fell off my feet. And I know without their help I wouldn't have made it, because I just didn't have any strength left to march anymore. And with their help, I made it back to Mauthausen.
Did that knowledge do anything for you?
If anything, it probably made me more determined to survive. Because, as I mentioned before, I always hoped that I would make it and be able to tell about it when it was all over.
Can you back up a little bit and give us some details about the death march? You said it was 8 days.
The march was 8 days.
Did you have food with you?
There too, as in many times before, on a long march or a trip when they moved the transport, they would always tell you that the kitchen was just ahead, or the food was coming up the next morning, or maybe tomorrow, or after 4 more hours, or something. The truth was that we got fed once in the 8 days, and we scrounged. It was early April, and the farmers were out working in the field, and they were planting sugar beets or potatoes or something, and we were running out of the march line and running into the field and stealing a potato here and there, and that's what we existed on.
And the guards were there. Wasn't that dangerous?
And the guards were there, and in some cases they fired. I think by that time, I don't think they were out to shoot to kill. I think they knew more than, I know they knew more than we did. They knew how close the end of the war was. And I think they were interested in saving their own necks. When we got to Mauthausen, many of the guards were already, had already run away. The camp was in horrible shape. There was no running water, no food.
Let's back up a little bit first. If you were in such poor shape, how about the other prisoners who were perhaps older and less strong than you? Can you tell us about the other?
Well, many dropped along the side of the road, and there were instances where I saw where guards fired into these people to finish them off. They would have died, or maybe not. But you couldn't drop out of the line. You couldn't just sit down and wait and hope that something would happen. They didn't just leave you there.
But without the aid of these two men that you knew, were they from your hometown?
No. I don't even remember their names. They were older than I remember that. Everybody was older than I. But they practically carried me the last 2 or 3 days.
And when you arrived at Mauthausen, you were describing it.
When we arrived in Mauthausen, the crematorium, which was there, wasn't functioning anymore. Bodies were stacked up like firewood in camp. There was no running water and very little food. This was the 8th of April, and I don't remember too much about the following 4 weeks, except the night before we were liberated. I remember hearing small arms fire that you could detect. That that was the first time that we were fairly certain that whether it was the American army or the British or the Russian, we didn't know, that something was happening, that they were getting close.
How long were you in Mauthausen before?
4 weeks before the end of the war.
And you don't recall the 4 weeks?
I recall very, very little about it.
It was overcrowded.
It was crowded. I remember being very run down. I was sick. My feet were swollen.
Do you know what illness you had?
I know I suffered from dysentery and typhus because I ended up in a hospital immediately after liberation.
Other than that, it's a blur, those 4
That
weeks.
4 weeks was really, today it's a blur. Looking back, I don't remember how I got through those 4 weeks, because I know the condition I was in when we arrived there.
Were those two men still with you?
Yes, yes. Now, whether they survived or they made it, I don't know.
But you recall the night before?
I recall the Friday night, the night before we were liberated. We were liberated on a Saturday morning. And
who were you liberated by?
The American Army. I think it was the 5th Army. And all night, Friday night, we could hear gunfire. And Saturday morning, we got up and looked around, and there were no guards in sight. They had all run away. Of course, there was a reason to celebrate as much as we could celebrate. By mid-morning, I remember it was a beautiful sunny day. By mid-morning, an American tank broke through the gate, and of course everything broke loose then. Unfortunately, the army wasn't ready to handle what was happening there, and too many people overate, and they died as a result of that. They brought up the field kitchens and they opened up everything, and they were giving out whole loaves of bread, I remember. Whatever you could take, whatever you could eat. The first meal we got was baked beans and frankfurters and bread. But the next morning, or maybe even the same day, I was in a hospital. And I spent the next 6 weeks in a hospital.
Were you in a displaced persons camp afterward?
No, I didn't stay in a DP camp. I was befriended by an American Army officer who worked on the staff of General Mark Clark, who was the military governor of Austria. And he took me under his wing, and he took me to Linz, Austria, from the hospital, and he looked after me. And he placed me with a shoemaker who subsequently I found out who was an ex-Nazi, who was about to lose his shoe shop. He was an orthopedic shoemaker. And he placed me there so they shouldn't take the shop away from him through with the denazification program that they instituted. They were they jailed him. He was in and out of jail a number of times. And every time he would be jailed, I would talk to this friend of mine who worked in General Mark Clark's office, and he would be released. He tried to make amends. He made shoes and boots free of charge for many of the refugees, many of the displaced people.
How did you feel about being in association with him?
Very ambivalent. I was told that I was doing a job. I was placed there for a reason, so he could continue running his shop and make shoes for people who needed shoes. So he was serving a purpose. But what made things even worse was that he was part Austrian and part Hungarian. He spoke Hungarian. He learned his trade in Budapest after the First World War. And we became friends. I lived at his house. I worked in the shop. And I learned the trade in the year that I spent there.
You were with him for a year?
I was with him for a year.
You had attempted to see if any members of your family had survived?
I had registered with the International Red Cross, which was routine. Everybody that left camp was automatically registered, even even before I was hospitalized. We were all registered, and I tried to find any members of the family. I got in touch with people in my hometown, corresponded with them. And through one of these people, I found out that my oldest brother, who was in Russia in 1942, was seen alive during the war in Russia, in a POW camp. So I had at least that to hope for, that that he was alive.
You didn't consider returning home?
I did. In fact, I had a travel permit, which I have a copy of. And I went as far as Vienna. I traveled from Linz to Vienna, and I wanted to go back and look around to see if anybody returned. I couldn't get myself to go back. I was probably afraid of what I wouldn't find. I kept in touch with people who had gone back, and people who were not deported, a Gentile family who I still have some of the correspondence that I had with him. And he kept me informed who were the people who were returning. And of course, other than my brother, who I found out later, who was alive in Russia, no one else came back.
What made you decide to come to the United States?
I met a man whose name was Peter Brachfeld. He worked for the Joint Distribution Committee in Linz. He applied for my papers. He had everything taken care of and processed, and the first thing I knew, I got a telegram one day to report to a transit camp in Salzburg. And that was the first thing I knew about it. He, being older than I, was able to assess the situation better than I. And he told me that...
How old were you at this time?
Oh, this was... I was 15. This was 45.
Did you come straight to Detroit?
I arrived in New York on September 16th, and we were housed in an old hotel in the Bronx. You
came with him?
No, he stayed there. He worked for the Joint, and he stayed there for several years after. He subsequently ended up in Toronto, and occasionally I still contact him. We see each other.
Who did you come with?
The group of people I came over with consisted of about 300 young people under 18 who had no dependents, no family, either here or in Europe. Harry Truman, that time, I don't know if it was a presidential order or pushed legislation through Congress to permit young people under 18 to come in over and above the national quota. So I didn't have to wait for the Hungarian quota to open up. There were about 300 of us on the ship. It was a relatively small troop carrier. And
a Jewish agency had probably sponsored
the Jewish agency was called the U.S. Committee for Children. They were in charge of us. And we had chaperones on the ship who looked after us.
And you all went to New York?
We all went to New York, and we were all housed in a hotel in the Bronx. And at this point, the local welfare agencies took over, and they had requests from families all over the country to have young people stay with them either on a temporary or a permanent basis. And This was a week before the high holidays in 1946. And I suggested to the people who were in charge that I would like to be somewhere with someone, with a family, for the high holidays. And they told me that there was an opportunity to go to Detroit to a family who wanted someone to live with them. Or if I wanted to wait till after the holidays, there was someone on the West Coast in the Los Angeles area that also wanted people to stay with them. So I told them, no, I'd rather be somewhere for the holidays. So they put me on a train in New York, and the next morning I arrived in Detroit, and a social worker by the name of Miss Goldstein waited for me at the railroad station, and that was the beginning of my life.
Who was the family that you lived with?
Kuhn. It was the Kuhn family.
They had other children?
They had other children, 2 still living at home. Sam Kuhn, who was a math teacher at Central High at that time. He's a retired school teacher now. And Ruth Kuhn, who is married to Martin Rose, who is active in the Sharasa Plate. And I lived with them for about a year, and then I moved away from this family. I lived with another family. But the day after I arrived in Detroit, I met a man who later was to be my father-in-law, my wife's father. I was introduced to him on the way home from the synagogue. And because he asked me to come over and meet his family, and which I did, not immediately, but shortly thereafter. And I met my present wife and my brother-in-law at that time. And about a year later, maybe 2 years later, I moved in with my future in-laws. I lived there for about 2 years. And then I moved out of there and I lived with a cousin for about a year. At that point, shortly thereafter, I became engaged to my wife. In between, I skipped things. I went.
How about your schooling?
My schooling. I enrolled in school.
You didn't know English when you came?
I didn't know English. I started school immediately. The Kuhners were very interested in...
You were 18 years old, but you hadn't been in school.
Right.
So did you start in a lower grade?
I started in an English class tailored to new Americans who arrived here without any knowledge of the English language.
Was this a night school?
No, it was all day. It was at Hutchins Intermediate, which was on Woodrow Wilson and Claremont. And this was in October, shortly right after the high holidays. And the Kuhners were also interested in furthering my Jewish education, and they enrolled me at the yeshiva on Linwood and Elmhurst. So in the morning I would go to school. In the afternoon, after school, I would go to Hebrew.
And how did you feel about religion?
Well,
at this point?
The decision, I'm backtracking now, the decision came in New York when I decided that I wanted to be somewhere for the high holidays. The intervening year from liberation to 1946, having lived with a Gentile family in Austria, I observed absolutely nothing. I didn't keep any holidays. I rebelled. That was my period of rebellion. But when I arrived in New York, I decided that I wasn't going to win an argument with God. that for the sake of the memory that I had of my parents, I owed them the respect. Besides, for my own inner satisfaction and peace of mind, I needed that some kind of order, some kind of...
So your faith endured
I don't know
despite the Holocaust experience.
I don't know if it endured at that point or it came back to me because I didn't find anything to substitute for it. I know of a lot of people who came out here and threw everything overboard. They couldn't continue to believe in a God that they lost faith in and could stand by and see their family destroyed.
But you didn't feel that way.
I had ambivalent feelings about it, and I still do to this day. But I couldn't live with it, and I couldn't live without it. I don't know what was stronger, my knowledge that my parents and my brothers and sisters, my grandfather, who I had a tremendous respect for his memory to this day. I felt that I owed them something. I owed something to their memory, that they died because they were Jews. And I felt I was letting them down by deserting the cause, by deserting the faith. So I came back to it. So the choice was made in New York. And they asked me if I wanted to go to an observant family or it didn't make any difference. And I told them, yes, I wanted to go to an observant family.
Do you think it was that same thinking that enabled you to survive?
It would be easy to say that it was, but...
To what do you attribute your survival?
Circumstances. Willpower was a part of it. Luck was a tremendous part of it. For me to believe that I survived because I deserved it more than members of my family or my grandfather, who I considered an angel, it wouldn't be fair to them. I wasn't picked to survive. I'm sure there are people who will say that I survived because God's hand was there and He wanted me to survive. If that's the case, it's beyond my understanding.
Probably timing had a lot to do with your...
Timing had an awful lot to do with it.
Does the past ever interfere with your life today?
Oh, other than not being able to sleep the night after I come here and speak to a group, or the not being able to sleep well the night before I speak here.
Tell us about your speaking experiences. You're involved with the Holocaust Center. Had you been telling your story?
Yes. First of all, I got involved here at the Holocaust Center through my daughter Gloria, who's a guide here. And who not incidentally, but I love very much and I respect very much, because she put herself through a tremendous strain and effort to be able to cope with this, because she's very sensitive to me, and she's very aware of my background through my wife's efforts, who educated the kids at an early age.
What were your feelings about discussing your experiences?
I think there were times when I would have liked to be able to talk about it, but I couldn't get myself to open up. And looking back now, I think partly I was afraid that they would feel sorry for me if I talk about it, and I didn't want that. I don't think any of the survivors want people to feel sorry for them.
So it was through your wife, who was not a survivor, that your children learned?
Yes, it was, that was the first time they had learned about it, the fact that they didn't have two sets of grandparents. And I came home one day from my travels, and my wife told me that she had told the story to the children, and in a way, my first reaction was that, well, they're too young. They shouldn't have to learn about this yet. And then, on the other hand, I was glad that she did, so I wouldn't have to do it.
Did you talk with your children?
Subsequently, yes.
When they were young?
Yes, as they were growing up, I told stories of my years growing up in Hungary, not directly about the camps and what I went through in the concentration camps, more about the type of family and the type of life that we led as a normal family in Hungary in the 1930s. The happy occasions, the not so happy occasions. I tried to deal with it in some cases in a lighthearted manner. I remember one of the children asking me about camping. I think one of them wanted to go to a summer camp, and I told him that I didn't have such good camping experience, so I'd rather you not go, or something to that effect. And whenever I would bring up anything about the camp, I would shrug it off and make light of it, rather than tell him about the atrocities and the.
What are your feelings about discussing your experiences with groups who come into the Holocaust Center today?
I think it's very important, and the more I do it, the more I'm aware of it, that how important it is for me to do it, because not everybody is able to talk about it even now, 40 years after. And if I don't do it, who will? I was there, I saw it, I survived, and I think part of my legacy is to talk about it.
Do you want to mention about your children who are active in Chaim?
Yes, my children attend meetings. They're members of Chaim, and besides their Jewish education and their upbringing in an observant home, they wanted to be more aware of problems that other children of survivors have faced. And I think by and large, my children feel quite fortunate that we have dealt with this, with the past, as well as we have, again, thanks to my wife, who was able to tell them about it at an age where they couldn't fully appreciate the enormity of the of the Holocaust, but they learned about it gradually, and consequently they're informed. They know and they understand me better. They can identify with grandparents that they never knew. And I think they're better off for it. I think they're more all around better informed and better educated Jews because of it.
Do you have anything else to add to the interview?
A couple of things. One, one idea that always recurs, always comes back to me, is the lack of support that the Jewish community of Europe got from the Jewish community of this country and of Western Europe, such as France and England, and the governments of the Western governments, such as the United States and England and France. That always bothered me. We know what the Nazis did, what they were responsible for. But by good people not getting involved at a crucial time, I'm afraid that many lives were lost because of that. Because too many people were willing to believe that things weren't as bad as they were told. And you could make a case for almost a conspiracy between the Jewish leadership at that time and the government of the United States, who wanted to keep it as quiet as possible.
In your reading and your studying, this is what you feel is...
I read the report that Arthur Goldberg's commission came up with when he was appointed to study the situation. I read Elie Wiesel's books. He writes about it in great length, and many other books. And I'm not indicting anybody, and I'm not accusing anybody. I'm merely sounding it as a warning for good people to get involved, rather than hoping that things will work out, as we all did during the last war.
You have brought in a few mementos. If I hold them up, would you tell us about it?
Yes, these are well, they were used as exchange value in Mauthausen and also several other camps. This particular one was given out in Buchenwald. They were used to purchase soap. I don't remember being able to get anything else for it. Certainly wasn't able to buy food for it. They were used as a premium. This piece of paper is a certificate. It's falling apart. From Mauthausen, showing my name and the number and the signature of the American lieutenant colonel who signed it, who took part in the liberation of the Mauthausen concentration camp. This was a receipt for packages that were handed out during 1945, early 46, Red Cross packages, food packages containing powdered milk and canned cheese and food and crackers and so on. And this was a travel permit that I obtained in fall of 1945 to travel to Vienna, which was supposed to take me back to my hometown in Hungary, but I never completed the journey. The swastika that you see crossed out on the cover was the booklet was used apparently during the war, and they continued to use it, but they crossed it out after the war. The word Deutschland is also crossed out, and Österreich, which is Austria, stamped in under it. I don't know if the camera will be able to pick this up, but this is what I looked like in 1945.